All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So thanks everybody for coming out. Today we're going to talk about WYSIWYG, how you can unleash the power of Drupal content creation. So for anybody who doesn't know me, my name is Martin Anderson-Clutz. I am a senior product marketing manager for Drupal at Acquia. I am on a podcast called Talking Drupal. During the Starshot initiative, I was the events recipe track lead. And if anybody wants to reach out to me, you can find me as ManClue on a variety of Drupal and social platforms. So what is a Drupal text format? It's something you can use to sort of limit or not which tags can be used as part of the content that your content creators are making your Drupal site. Each format can be associated with a WYSIWYG editor as well as how it's configured. It will define filters that can be used to modify user input before it's actually output to the browser. And as we'll see, each text format can have permissions in terms of which roles can actually use that format. So I did use this term earlier, WYSIWYG. Anybody know what WYSIWYG means? Yeah.
What you see is what you get.
Right. What you see is what you get, because there was a time when editors, people would have to actually write tags around different things if they wanted to bold text or to make headings or different things like that. So it's really sort of that idea of kind of like a word style editor. So oftentimes it'll have kind of that bar at the top that has, you know, buttons and or drop downs, those kinds of things to make give sort of a visual interface, in addition to actually showing sort of a visual representation of how the content will look when it's actually output to the browser. It can include an option, so we've got the source button you can see there on the right. Drupal uses CKEditor 5 as sort of its default WYSIWYG editor, but there are others that you can use because they are replaceable. So here's an example. If you actually use that source button, you can see here we've got the tags. So under the hood, it's still using kind of HTML markup, but there are some sort of Drupalisms in here. So we've got like data entity attributes and some of those kinds of things. And we'll talk in a minute about how those actually get altered as those get written to the browser. So if you were to save that page, this is what that would look like rendered in the Olivero front-end theme. You can see it's actually a little different from what we had seen in the WYSIWYG editor. And if we look at the output in the browser of this page, you can see that there are some differences. So again, bringing back that, if we look at the image tag here, we can see that that's actually been expanded when it's actually written out to the final page. Sort of wrapped in kind of this figure element with the fig caption and some other things. So there is also some manipulation. That's really where the filters come to play as part of the overall text format configuration. So let's do a demo of how text formats actually influence how the input gets accepted by your Drupal page. So this is a fairly stock install of Drupal 11.3. And what I'm going to show here is copying some content from, in this case, a Google Doc. So what we see a lot of teams doing is using some kind of collaboration tool before they put the content into their Drupal site, and so that can be something they sort of pass around. Each person can make some changes. Sometimes they'll copy and paste from other documents, and so what you can end up with are things like having sections that are using different fonts, maybe some that were highlighted, different text colors, but there's a mixture of things that we probably would want to carry through. So things like, you know, links, things that are bolded, maybe even tables and headings. And then some of the formatting, things that we would actually rather be cleaned up, because typically on a website you want the website to really govern, you know, how those things should look. So let's go ahead and copy the top section of this. And now when we paste it into our WYSIWYG, you can see it's done a fairly decent job. Actually, if you go to the very top, you can see that because it was an H1 in the other document, Drupal doesn't usually allow H1 as one of the tags within the WYSIWYG, and so it's actually just left as plain text. We've got an H2, we've got some links, bold, and then our table is really just sort of plain text. And that's because Drupal defaults to this basic HTML that doesn't allow some of those tags that would be needed to represent things the way that they looked in the Google Doc. Now, if we switch to restricted HTML and paste that in, you can see really the entire thing now is just basic HTML. So there is no WYSIWYG for restricted HTML. You can see there is sort of a very short list of the tags that are allowed, and really the intent for restricted HTML is for people to sort of hand code the tags that would appear in there. And then if we we switch to the last of the default text formats that are provided by Core, and we do a fresh paste in here. So delete that and paste it in. Now you can see we do have our table represented, which is great, but if we scroll up, you can see we also have a bunch of that markup that we said we didn't want, right? So we've got different fonts in here, we've got different font colors, even the H1, which again is typically not a best practice to have more than one H1 on a page. And if we look at our source, you can see we've got all kinds of inline styling, which can be a real pain to clean up after the fact. And so that can be certainly a problem. And it's sort of classically one of the things that you see, particularly, I think copying and pasting from Word was kind of like the most infamous sort of perpetrator in terms of putting garbage markup into Drupal sites. So let's talk about some ways that we can help to mitigate that. So again, these are the default ones. If you install Drupal, Drupal 11, you'll have a basic HTML, allows your editors to have some HTML tags, provide some options around like how to align different things, being able to caption images, has some setup for things like media library and so on. Restricted HTML, its default setup only allows a very small subset of HTML tags. There's no WYSIWYG. It will do things like convert line breaks and URLs into their respective tags. I think it's really probably meant to be used more for things like comments, where you don't want people to be able to do it a whole lot. I wouldn't say I'd use that one a whole lot myself. Full HTML really allows any HTML tags. And we sort of saw where that can be good but also bad. And then plain text will have sort of all HTML tags escaped. So it's really meant to be just sort of for text with no tags at all. Now somebody might look at the demo that we just did and say, if I don't want to go through the work of figuring out exactly which tags I should allow people to use on my site, maybe I should just use full HTML and then trust that people aren't going to do anything malicious with it. But that's actually not a very good idea. So using full HTML means that people can do different kinds of cross-site scripting injection attacks. And so you definitely want to be very judicious, very restrictive in terms of who you give access to that full HTML text format, in addition to the fact that it also creates some of those potential formatting issues that we saw earlier in the demo. In security circles, there is this principle of least privilege. So really what you want to do is only give people the amount of access that corresponds to what they need to actually do their job. And really, if you give people sort of access to broad permissions to do things like, paste arbitrary HTML into a text area, it can create broad problems. So again, you want to really try and be as restrictive as possible in terms of the access that you grant to people. So let's go ahead and demo what it would look like to update a text format in that same environment. So if we go into our basic HTML, we go into our configuration for this particular text format, you can see that we have the roles here. And so this is how you can control which users will be able to use different text formats. Here is where you can switch the text editor. So right now, by default, CKEditor 5 is the only one that ships with Drupal, but there are different ones that you can install. There are a couple for using Markdown, but you would install extra modules to be able to use those. And now you have sort of the active toolbar, and then there are additional available ones that you can sort of move into the toolbar to provide extra capabilities here. So we're going to drag in the table one, put that in there, and then maybe we'll also drag in the style component here. And so one of the things that I'll point out is as you drag items into the active toolbar, it's going to automatically update. There's a field down at the bottom of the text format where it's going to show allowed HTML tags but notice here that it says with CKEditor 5, this is a read-only field. So it's actually automatically determining what are the tags that are allowed based on which buttons you have active in the toolbar. And a couple of other things I'll mention here is you can see some of these will include, after the tag name, things like ID or hreflang and href. Those are really sort of the attributes that you're allowed to put on those different tags. In addition to the ones that are listed, all of these elements can also add classes to the individual tags that way. So it's not explicitly stated, but all of those will allow classes to be applied as well. So up here in the toolbar is where you sort of manage which buttons are going to be available, but each of the buttons also corresponds to a plugin, and then the plugin can have different settings. So for the headings, if you wanted to allow people to have other H1s on the page, you can just click to enable that or disable that. Same with all of the others. Same thing with the styles. So we could say maybe we want to not only allow table tags in our basic HTML format, but we want people to be able to apply something like, let's say, a table and a fancy class. So we would have to, in our theme CSS, actually have CSS that when a table has that class applied would make it look different in some way. But we could just call this fancy table. And maybe we want in the WYSIWYG for people to be able to apply a class, a button class that I know is in the Olivero theme, and just call this button link. So there's an example of where you can basically manually populate what's going to appear in the style dropdown by sort of determining. You could leave it sort of more blank. So if you just said like that, then that effectively will be something you can apply to anything, but more often it's useful to sort of determine the specific tag. The source editing element is where you can determine sort of additional elements. If there are things that you want people to be able to use that don't have a plugin available, you can add that to here. But I will point out, if you do something like this and say, I want to add something that there actually is also a plugin available to support, then Core will basically get grumpy at you and tell you that there's sort of a duplication there, and so before you can save it, you actually need to remove the duplicate element. But this can be a quick way if there's certain kinds of elements that you want to be able to sort of copy and paste in or allow people to like manually edit source and put into the document. You can make that something that will actually render. It can also be useful if, as an example, you want to support IDs in other tags that aren't sort of supported by default down here. Up here is where you can sort of add that support as well. For lists, there's also the ability to sort of decide what controls people can have in terms of turning things into like ordered or unordered lists. How they can upload images, including sort of where images uploaded using this inline image uploader will go. Things like file size, maximum dimensions, and so on. Whether they can resize those as part of the WYSIWYG. And then there's a variety of different filters that you can use here. So again, by default, the basic HTML will limit the allowed HTML tags, as we've seen. There are some other things in here. It's probably easiest to sort of explore some of those default text formats to sort of get an understanding of what some of these things do. Some of them are fairly self-explanatory, so displaying HTML tags as plain text, converting line breaks into HTML, converting URLs into links, and so on. These last couple, as well as the displaying the HTML as plain text, you will see in that plain text format that we talked about earlier on. There is also the ability to change the filter processing order. I would say out of the box, the common use cases are probably addressed really well by how these things are configured in Core, so you probably won't find too many cases where you need to sort of play with those. But sometimes there will be cases where Particularly if you're adding contrib modules, there may be places where you need to be careful about exactly how these are ordered. And I find usually those are documented in terms of the module documentation there as well. You can also do things like, say, maybe you want to add rel equals nofollow, kind of an SEO best practice. But again, you can sort of configure that at the text format level. But having added the table to our basic HTML, now we can go back to our page here, and if we refresh, now if we paste in here, now we have our table rendered perfectly. We'll just call this our test page and save that. And so again, you can see it's pretty close to what we saw in the WYSIWYG, which is kind of what we would hope to achieve as part of the overall configuration. Any questions around sort of the configuration of different text formats? Yes?
Well, why would you use something other than CKEditor 5? Like, it seems like you use so much.
Yeah, so reasons for using something other than CKEditor 5, I mean, certainly as we seem to be getting more and more into like an AI-first web, there are lots of people who are kind of leaning more on Markdown. And so CKEditor 5 can accept Markdown as an input style. So you can do things like the hash marks as a way to create headings and some of those kinds of things on sort of the input level, but it's still saving and rendering HTML. Whereas you might prefer to use something that actually will store and display kind of more native Markdown. So that might be one example. I know there are sometimes other editors that that might have specific capabilities that you're looking for. Like I know, as an example, CKEditor, there is a plugin you can get to do like find and replace, but there may be like certain kind of more niche things that you're looking for. I know one of the things we'll talk about is there is a CKEditor premium features editor that does like has sort of collaborative editing features. I know there are other editors that you can use to do that in more of an open source way. And so that might be another example of where, like, if you need that capability, but you don't want to go down the like premium features, then you could go to this other editor that has, you know, kind of that more open source collaboration as an example. So it's really about the capabilities that individual editors might have. But you're right, for a lot of people, CKEditor 5 is more than adequate. And, you know, there was a lot of sort of deliberation when the Drupal community decided which editor settle on. It was by no means sort of a done deal that because Drupal had been using CKEditor 4, that CKEditor 5 was going to be the successor. There was sort of a very deliberate process of looking at alternatives, and it seemed like, particularly because of, you know, open source licensing and different things, that it still continued to meet the needs of the community. But, you know, because Drupal is open source, it's also, you know, API first, and that means there is this API that if you wanted to use another editor, you're certainly free to use that as well. So maybe that's a long-winded way of answering your question, but yeah. Any other questions before we move on? Looks like we're good. All right. So let's go on here. Talk about, so hopefully you can see, you know, the actual power of using different text formats, certainly in terms of what formatting can be applied, how the input will be processed and turned into different things. There are also, as we talked about, security concerns, as well as the ability to add additional capabilities to specific text formats as well. I really think that text formats are a powerful way to sort of, you know, provide a lot of really advanced features for your editors, really give them sort of powerful capabilities. And so let's talk about some of the ways that we can sort of enhance that out-of-the-box experience. So certainly there are Drupal modules that you can install. And by the way, when you see these with the, you know, blue underlined links, these are actually links to the modules. So, you know, the actual module names are there, but I will make these slides available. So if anybody wants sort of this as a quick reference to find these, you'll have access to those as well. So there is, as an example, a module for responsive tables. So if you have tables that you want to sort of work a little better on mobile screens because they're really wide, as an example, responsive tables can help with that. I know I have personally had to work on sites where they needed like footnotes to do citations and different things. There is also a details accordions module, and that's basically for doing things that are kind of like accordions, but I actually happen to be a maintainer of that, so we may as well jump in and see what it looks like to go ahead and add that as well. So if we go accordion and install that module. Now if we go back into our basic HTML, we'll see a new button here, add accordion. So let's drag that in over here. We can save that for our text format. And now when we go back in here, if we go in to edit our content page again, now we can see we have that ability to add an accordion. So we could say, cool, open that up, pretty cool stuff. There is also the ability to do things like nest details elements. So the actual HTML spec for details elements is pretty permissive in terms of what things can go, particularly in sort of the main body. So you can nest stuff, but you probably shouldn't. So let's go ahead and save that, and now we can see here. So by default, it really doesn't do any formatting. Again, that's sort of left up to your theme layer to decide how you want those things to look. This is really just sort of the stock browser default for how details elements are rendered with that little sort of toggle. But there's lots of ways you can format that in your CSS. But you can nest them as deeply as you want. It does create some usability problems. So if, as an example, somebody does a search for something and the text that actually matches what they were searching for is like nested 4 levels deep, it's going to be pretty hard for them to find that. I mean, one good thing is because details is sort of like a native HTML tag, if in your browser you say we want to search for something and the result is within there, it will automatically expand that. So a user who's at least savvy enough to do the find in page will be able to still find that even if it's nested deep, but not every user will know to do that. And so that's why I would say you don't probably want to tell your editors not to go too deep in terms of nesting things in accordions would be my recommendation.
Is that CSS or JavaScript?
Neither. It's a native HTML element. It's the details HTML element. And so one of the benefits is, you know, you don't need JavaScript, you don't need CSS, and also it's more accessible because screen readers need to support, you know, standard HTML tags, so you don't have to worry as much about sort of, you know, accessibility concerns as well. So details elements for things like accordions, in my mind, is definitely sort of the best way to achieve some of those things. All right, let's see what we're doing for time here. All right, in a similar way, you can also do things like use modules that enhance some of the existing tags. So there is editor advanced link where you can sort of add additional properties to links within your WYSIWYG. There is a module called CKEditor table fix that allows you to do sort of more advanced properties for how you render tables. There is one called CKEditor anchor link. So if you want to give editors the ability to sort of place anchors in the page so that you can link to specific parts of the page, again, that's something that you can add in a similar way using available modules. From a processing standpoint, as we saw earlier, using different filters really allow you to sort of transform what's going to be passed into the CKEditor into something completely else. So token filter is one. I wouldn't say I use a lot, but it's really powerful when you need it. Entity embed can be really powerful for being able to reuse kind of snippets of content in different places in the site. So maybe you've got certain like call to action banners that you want to sort of embed within your content in various places and then be able to sort of have a single place to update those and have that instantly reflected everywhere. That can be really useful. And then there's this non-breaking space filter that can be used to sort of control, as an example, if you need to have spaces between a word and punctuation, but don't want that to wrap, some of those kind of more advanced use cases. But here, what we'll do is go ahead and show what the token filter looks like. So let's go token filter, get that installed. If we go into our text format again, we will add the token browser to our toolbar. Notice that we also have replace global and entity tokens with their values. You do have the ability here to sort of limit which token types are going to show up as available. So maybe we don't want everything. We just want, let's say, current page and nodes to make things a little simpler for our editors. So let's go ahead and save that. Go back into our page here. And now when we edit this, we can say, okay. And then we can grab a token to say current page, current page title. And let's add this. And then add one more to say node content type. So this is a bit of a goofy example, but if we save this now and we scroll down, you can see it says, we hope you like this test page, basic page, this being the title. In just for this one sort of like insertion within the text, it's probably not super useful. Like if you were doing something like repeating what the title is at several places, knowing that it might change, then using tokens for that could be helpful, because now if we say change our title to updated and then save that and go back down, any place that token is used within the text, it will automatically be updated. So again, in places where you want it to be a little more dynamic, being able to insert things like tokens can be really useful, but tokens can also be things like, site name, a variety of other things. And so being able to use tokens can be really useful. Also, tokens are things that you can write custom. And so if you need a way to have the current, daily NASDAQ index, inside your content and not have to go in and update your page every day to get that updated, writing a custom token that will go out, pull that in via API, and then store that as kind of a local setting, and then have that automatically reflected potentially multiple places in your site. Could be a time-saving piece. So tokens are not necessarily super obvious, the sort of power and capability of those out of the box, but definitely something that can be very interesting to explore. All right, and it wouldn't be a presentation in 2026 if we didn't mention AI at some point. So AI is one of the many sort of capabilities that you can add to sort of that editor experience using things like Drupal modules. Markdown Easy is a module that will do something like provide another editor, again, specifically designed for allowing Markdown, as well as sort of, different rendering strategies. And then CKEditor 5 premium features. We already talked about this a little bit. We'll sort of show it very briefly to show some of the capabilities. But if you use the AI module and you install the submodule specifically for working with CKEditor, now you'll have this AI assistant that you can put into the toolbar, and then you can choose which different sort of specific capabilities that you want to be able to provide to different users. And again, that can vary by text formats. You can have maybe a basic one that only has a couple, and then for full HTML you want to expose more. Or it could be a way to say, again, because these can be role specific, you could say maybe for sort of like simple editors we only want to allow them a couple of capabilities, or maybe for, like we've got a translator role, to only give them the translate capability, right? So it can be a way to sort of expose some of these in a more granular way. But you can have capabilities of sort of like the pure generative AI, either create an outline for a blog post that I want to write, or go ahead and write the entire first draft, and then I can sort of go through and fix it up, look for hallucinations, those kinds of things. There's more of a broad, like modify with a prompt. That sounds a little sort of free form, so I don't think that's something that I'd want to grant people sort of, broad access to. Things like reformat HTML, so you could say, turn this into a series of bullet points instead of just sort of plain text. You could do things like have it look for spelling or grammar errors. You can do things like have it summarize text, which is actually really good, something AI is really good at. You can have it change tone or translate. And one of the things that's really interesting about both of these is that it typically can be used with sort of taxonomy terms, where you can put in the term description, basically a description for the AI of how to interpret that. So you could have, let's say with tone, one that says like, tell me like I'm 5, and then have a paragraph that in detail explains to AI exactly what you're looking for in terms of how to translate it to that tone. And so that can actually be a really powerful way to give your editors a simple way to sort of make sure that maybe it's like trying to unify the voice of the blog articles, as an example, that are on your site. Can really be powerful that way. So there's lots of different capabilities. Who here was in the AI training yesterday? We got one, okay. So there was definitely talk about other ways that you can sort of infuse AI into the content editing experience beyond the WYSIWYG. But certainly for our talk today, this is probably the most relevant. We did talk about the CKEditor premium features. So here's an example. So you can see the ability to make kind of like inline comments. You can have like threaded discussions as part of this, have version tracking. So it is pretty sophisticated. Lots of things that people have been wanting for a while to be able to do directly in the editor, because maybe your organization isn't able to use things like Google Docs or Office 365, so to be able to have all of this directly in the editor sometimes can be sort of an important capability. But again, there is a subscription required to be able to have access to this through CKEditor. So one of the things that we saw at the beginning is that sometimes the WYSIWYG editor, the way your content is represented there, actually doesn't sort of entirely accurately represent how that content will look when it's actually published in the front-end theme. So there is in your theme this ability to specify one or more style sheets that should be pulled into CKEditor, so that you can sort of tweak that to make sure that what people are seeing in the WYSIWYG is actually more reflective of how things will look. And so within that style sheet, sort of the best practice is to prefix your selector with this class, CK content. Because CKEditor 5 doesn't use an iframe, if you were to just say, change H1 to this color blue, then that would actually override in your admin theme the standard H1 styling. And so using this for sort of broad selectors like that is a good way to sort of contain them and make sure they only apply to within the WYSIWYG. But obviously, things like we talked about of like something that's like tag specific and a very, unusual class name as an example, it might not be as necessary. You might be able to get away with, let's say, a CSS file that you could use for both the front end and in the WYSIWYG if it was sort of like more specific styling for things with specific tags applied as well. So hopefully by now you've been able to see that which text formats you make available to different users and how you have them configured can have some pretty substantial impacts in terms of how they can format different kinds of text, how it'll be processed and sort of represented in different ways. There are also security implications, and so that's definitely something you should be thinking about in terms of how you set up your text formats, as well as some of the different capabilities that you can add within the editor as well. So you now have the power to go out and make an awesome experience, really, you go out and give your content editors superpowers. So, with great power comes great responsibility. Use it wisely. So, any questions?
Where does the AI come from?
So the AI module for Drupal, what I can do here is I can go ahead and say Drupal.org project AI. So if we look at the AI project, within here there is a submodule, modules, AI CKEditor. And so if you wanted to have those features, then you would go ahead and install that submodule as well as obviously the core module. And then...
where's it powered by?
You can, effectively it's LLM agnostic. So you can choose whether it's going to use, OpenAI or Claude or some other kind of LLM. You could use like an internally hosted one. It's really up to you. Yeah. Which again is one of the benefits of using an open source solution like Drupal. Any other questions? If folks wanted, we could show the process of setting up media library to work with CKEditor. Yes.
I have a question. So
yes.
Our users are really interested in real-time collaborations. I really appreciate you covering that bit.
Mm-hmm.
I know you had talked about the inline comments. Are there any other collaborative features that can be incorporated into the editor experience?
So I think it was Palantir that was working on the open source one. Let me see if I can find Drupal, or if anybody in the audience knows.
I don't remember the company.
Yeah.
You're probably right. It was
Palantir.
developing open source
Collaborative editor. Edit together. So I know they had put a lot of work into it. I can't remember how far it got in terms of being open sourced. I recall being at a session where they talked about it having it almost production ready. The challenge is that to support sort of the real-time aspect of it, you need some kind of a server solution. I think it's YJS that it's designed to run on. I think they had said that they had it where it could basically be open source, but they also were trying to roll out a commercial solution. So if people wanted more of a drop-in solution similar to the CKEditor one, that they could sort of have a thing that they could subscribe to. But as far as I know, it never really got sort of released in a ready-to-use version. So certainly from what I've seen, a lot of teams will sort of do the collaboration before they put it in Drupal. So, Office 365, Google Docs, those kinds of things, and then put it in Drupal. But certainly the most kind of production-ready example I've seen is the CKEditor one. Yeah. Yep. Any other questions? Anything people want to see?
Okay.
Yes.
The CKEditor team, all those tools, I know you have to pay for them. Do you know anyone using them and feel that they were successful? I've never been able to experiment with them. I don't know anyone using them. I'm just curious in your experience, someone using them, be yeah, totally worth the money. Some anecdotal experience of this is worth paying for, because it's a lot of hurdles to go through.
Yeah, and I think because it's sort of it's very usage-based in terms of what it costs them to provide. There isn't sort of tiered pricing where it's you can start for, X dollars a month, and then for teams of, 20 or more, it's, this price. It's sort of very how much is it going to cost? Well, let's talk, because it's sort of based on the number of editors, how often they're going to be making edits, which features you want. So it's very sort of custom, which I think is a barrier to adoption, if I'm honest, right? I feel if people knew, okay, for $200 a month, we could have this for teams up to 50 people, as an example. That would be easier for people to sort of get their mind around to be able to go get the sign-off in terms of getting the funding. But as far as I know, I've never really heard of sort of standardized pricing. I have actually used it myself firsthand, and it works really well. But I'm sure I've heard of a couple of, Acquia customers, because that's where I work, that have been using it, but I haven't, I'm not close enough to those teams to know what has been their experience and that kind of stuff.
I guess I'm going to ask another Acquia-related question, because the other approach, and how Pantheon explored it, and also, once again, the same statement might happen is how far they got with it, but using the Google Docs to offer content and then push that into Drupal, because Google Docs offers
Yes.
literally feature parity and more. And have you seen people doing that?
Yeah, I don't personally know of anybody that's using that. I've seen it demoed and it does look super cool. Obviously there are limitations because you're authoring in a different platform that only flows into one field within Drupal, which architecturally my mind is
You use the media library, which you didn't know.
yeah, so there's some things like that I sort of, struggle to sort of conceive how that would work in sort of a real world use case, but yeah, that can be another platform to look at as well. All right, yes.
Just curious, just kind of picking off the question of the CKEditor, I'm just curious, what other editors have you come across recently that are, still quite popular in use with Drupal?
So in terms of other editors that are popular with Drupal, I guess leaving alone the sort of recent part of the question.
Sure.
Back in the day, TinyMCE was one that was very popular. Back before Drupal kind of standardized on CKEditor.
Right.
I will say some of the Markdown editors are probably fairly popular.
Mm-hmm.
I've also seen some solutions for making kind of that source editing a little more robust.
Right.
So being able to have because every programmer loves the black screen, to have that as sort of more of a dark thing, to be able to have syntax highlighting in there, some of those kinds of things. So there are also even using CKEditor to have sort of the code editing part of it feel a little bit more like kind of a native IDE type experience.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
I have a question for the tables. So, the table column width, it depends on the content there, right? But sometimes in a situation that the page has two tables, they both have three columns. Our client will want each column has the same width. So I have to control it by CSS. But I just wonder whether there's a better way how to do that, because I want a more flexible way instead of control by CSS for that.
Yeah. So for controlling the width of columns in two separate tables,
Yeah.
yeah, I feel like probably. So as an example, going back to the demo that we saw, if you were to, so let's actually go back in here. So one of the things that you could do, if you wanted to again have people using your basic HTML, would be to do something like go into your source editing and say table style. So again, having to still resort to inline CSS, but you could still keep things fairly, didn't like that. So maybe that's not table following. Anyway, something related to that. There might be something in this, that might be a case where you have to write a plugin to be able to do that. But yeah, for doing that kind of stuff where you're really trying to keep things aligned that are not, they're separate, so you have to kind of manually force them to be the same. I feel like CSS is probably where you're going to have to end up, but yeah.
I forget, in the class attribute, can you say what classes are supported or allowed to stop? Because the style one gets crazy. But the class attribute, the example would be, could you say, I want these five tailoring properties supported, or custom classes? Is that possible in that?
Yeah, it's a good question. As far as I know, okay, so it's
class button.
Yeah, class equals button, and that's probably because when we edited this, we actually went into our style and sort of added that here, and so it knows that that class button needs to be explicitly available. So yeah, there's call span. I don't. It's a good question. As far as I know, CKEditor tends to be fairly permissive on classes, but very restrictive around sort of the actual style attribute
Yeah, you're right.
for the reason we're talking about. But
Hey, someone must have injected JavaScript into the style attribute or something.
oh, good question though. All right, we're actually over time, so thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah.